We are going to start off with the easy topic, the easy discussion question of what is a pie? Because as we started doing this research and we start looking at cookbooks, you start realizing the concept of a tart and a pudding and a pie and a cake start overlapping, and then they become slightly interchangeable. So that's no fun when you're trying to find some. But I mean, they're all delicious, right? So yeah, I mean, Catherine has a very easy definition for it because there's a technical definition for it.
Yeah, so that was kind of the first step, is like, what is a pie, and what was considered a pie through history, and that has changed based on who you ask and what time period you're in. So there really is no all-encompassing definition. The best I could do was it is pastry and stuff, because pie, as I found out, in the United States, pies are usually sweet. They have at least one crust, but they could have a top and a bottom, but not necessarily. However, in the United Kingdom, a pie has two crusts. It could be savory or sweet. So that was kind of like or both. And then, as Mary said, in history, you have things like tarts and puddings and cakes that we might consider pies today.
I was looking for the Marlborough cake, which was referenced as a pie for the 18th century, which turns into a pudding depending on what 17th century cookbook you were looking at. And then by the 19th century, when it was kind of out of existence, thanks to the temperance movement, because it includes things like sherry, it becomes Deerfield pie back. Like, it changes and it evolved into this. I had to literally make a little trail for myself to remember where it went and where it kind of fell off from. And the ingredients are still the same. So as long as you remember the list of things, you can trace it back that way. But what we think of as a pie today was very different, even from at least like 100 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, I find.
Yeah. And one of the things I was interested in is kind of tracing pie all the way back to, like, where do you get the first pie, which was also not as fruitful as I might have wanted it to be. But the earliest things we might consider pies came from, like, ancient Egypt, where they had like hand pies filled with honey and things like that. And then the Greeks and Romans started adding meat and having more savory pies. But it was really the French and the English who start adding things like butter into their pastry to have like an actual sturdy crust. And so it's really the type of thing we think of as pie today come from medieval Europe. And once you get there, then it just kind of goes all over the place.
Yeah. As I find, as I was even tracing pies that were specific to different parts of the colonies. So the 16th and 17th centuries were slightly erratic because nobody was writing down recipes at that time because they were trying to survive. But how Northeast was making pies versus the Southern colonies and what ingredients they were relying on. And you can see it from like a shoe fly pie situation in the Northeast to like peach pies and cobblers in the South. And I mean, they're all delicious, but you can see the amount of ingredients that they were using and the volume of ingredients were always different. Kind of all the same, but sometimes a little bit more and sometimes a little bit less.
Yeah. Yeah, so with pies, it was, as I kind of started looking into the medieval pies, right? That's where you get like the pies we we don't really have today, like all the bird pies. Chicken pot pie still kind of hung around, but you know, we have these things that have kind of remained in nursery rhymes and stuff like that. Um, you know, the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie was like a thing. Um, in the medieval period, songbirds were huge as a pie filling, very popular. But at the time, it was mostly meat and vegetables and spices, if you could afford it, that was wrapped in this kind of dense, not very tasty pastry dough. And that pastry was called a coffin, which in the period just meant a container for something. And it was essentially medieval Tupperware, because the purpose of that pastry was to have a container for your meat to cook in, and then something you could also take with you and transport it. And it also helps to preserve things, right? Because that pastry is supposed to be essentially airtight. And then when you're ready to eat it, you crack it open, and usually you'd actually discard the pastry, unless you were really desperate, because it was really just like butter and flour and nothing, and water.
Yeah. Yeah. It was truly a basic, like, keep it on, cook it, discard it when you didn't need to. And then they would put on new coffins as they wanted to recook and rebake and reheat, because they were able to preserve them so well. It's like I kept thinking of it like aluminum foil when you were trying to reheat leftovers in a casserole dish. And I was like, yeah, okay, I can see that, because it's so much different from, I mean, we're in Thanksgiving holiday season when you see all of these highly decorated pies that have shapes and colors and decorations and the skill on them. And then you're reading about coffins and they're just being discarded. And like, that's technically my favorite part of a pie right now. So I was like, oh, okay. Well, we won't be making that recipe.
Yeah. So when the first European settlers came to North America, they bring this pie tradition with them. But they, especially the Puritans landing in Massachusetts, but also in Virginia, right? They're getting exposed to all of these new foods from North America, and a lot of them are things like fruits and vegetables, and berries and all these sweet things, that they then just start putting into their pies. But at the same time, there's this culture of like simplicity, and so they're trying to find this balance between all of the different stuff that was going into pies in England, and they're using the North American stuff that they have available to them, and trying to find this balance of like, how does it all go together? And I think that's kind of the beginning of this shift away from the real savory pies, those real dense meat pies of England, to what all the different types of sweet pies that Americans consider pie today.
Yeah. And it definitely, I find as you go through time, 18th, 19th, especially in the 20th century, it's a way to mark this emerging American identity, especially as we've come out of the revolution, as we get a little bit towards the middle of the 18th, the 18th and the 19th century, excuse me. And they start pushing away from those traditional pies that people have been, especially the savory ones. And you kind of start to see this shift of like, well, this grows here and we're going to use this. And this is like what we're going to make, because this is the most American thing that we can do, because you are a new nation. You want to make yourself known, and they want to separate themselves from England. And the best way to do that is to make it with ingredients that they don't have access to.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in the first kind of few decades, I would say, after the revolution, you still see in the recipe books some of the savory pies, but not many. And I think there's like chicken and pigeon, and maybe one of the one that intrigued me the most was called sea pie. Um,
Oh, I saw that, yeah.
SEA, sea pie. It's not. It doesn't have any seafood in it. It's mostly like ground beef or ground pork, um, and chicken and stuff like that. But it's a very distinct pie. It was meant to be made at sea, but on a ship you don't have an oven, so it's actually a boiled pie that's in a crust. Like, think of just a normal pie, but you boil it instead of bake it. It was very weird, but that one lasted for a while, in recipe books for like the housewife. So
Yeah,
that was a little weird.
I do have a few. I was able to find some actual seafood-esque recipes. So I found one for shrimp pie and lobster pie. And I don't think that they're too off from, I mean, I don't eat seafood, but I mean, the ingredients and the way that it's prepared doesn't seem too far off from the way that you would still prepare a lobster pie today. I like cinnamon and nutmeg, so this is my favorite season of all. So anytime I see any kind of like nutmeg included in a recipe, I was like, well, that's the only thing you're going to taste. But this is even going back to 1746. So this is one of those earlier cookbooks. So a collection of above 300 recipes in cookery, and it has one of those very, very long titles. But it's a short book, but the recipes aren't too off from a diet that we would have today, which was really nice. Very relatable. You always think, you know, if anybody's ever looked through a colonial cookbook, which I implore you to do, you'll see like calf's head pie or pigeon pie and a bunch of animals that we don't necessarily consume today. So when you see things like a shrimp pie, I can do that. That's not too bad, right? Got cloves in it, anchovies you eat. You have to season it. You may make a good crust because they don't want much baking in your shrimp pie, but it's nice to see these recipes. I thought they were like good to add. Like simple ingredients, onion, your spices, your seafood, just to eat hot is always my favorite way that they end recipes. I saw that a few times and I was like, oh, it's so nice.
Yeah, so why don't we, so one of the things I noticed also was like a lot of these savory pies with the meat, they often also had fruit in them. It was very mixed, and most often the fruit was apple. So I can definitely see how you could very easily just, you didn't have meat one, you know, one day, or, you know, you didn't want it. It's very easy to get from this mixed meat apple pie to just an apple pie. Um, and one of the things that intrigued me, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised about it, but I think because we have like these phrases like as American as apple pie, but apple pie is not very American. I think we've made it very American in recent years. But it's one of these things that was brought over by colonial settlers. They had apples all over Europe. England has a lot of varieties of apples. And so that's one of the things I was really interested in. And I looked at some English cookbooks from early in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they had many different apple pie recipes. But I think my favorite cookbook to include apple pies is this one called The Country Housewife's Family Companion from 1750. they have a whole section on apple pies. And this book is meant for women, the wives of farmers in all over England, and how they can feed like the migrant workers who come to help them during harvest season and things like that, and how to feed them well but cheaply. And apple pie was considered like the best way to do this, according to this cookbook author. But the apple pie section starts with a 2-page poem. It's a very long poem about apple pie. So I am just gonna, it's 2 pages, it was very long, but I'm just gonna read the first stanza, the first 4 lines. So this poem is called Of Apple Pies, a poem by Mr. Wellstead. And of all the delicates which Britons try to please the palate or delight the eye, of all the several kinds of sumptuous fare, there's none that can with apple pie compare.
I'm, 2 pages of apple pie, I would listen to it.
Yeah.
So do you know where that was published?
I don't know. I was trying to look up who this Mr. Wellstead, the poet, is, but I couldn't find anything. The cookbook is from kind of central England, I guess what's called the Midlands.
Interesting.
And they had a couple of recipes from like various farmers, I guess, from around the region. And they varied in quality. There was one it's literally just apples and crust that you bake, no seasonings, no anything. And I guess if you use the right apples, that'd be
It'll
perfect.
Be sweet enough.
Yeah. But there's this line in it that's like, you can take the stems and the cores and the seeds out if you wish. If you want your workers to like you, I suggest you do that. So I guess there were people out there who were just chopping up the whole apple and throwing it in the pie.
Oh my goodness. I need a little seasoning. I need a nutmeg, a cinnamon. I need something. Listen, sliced up apples in the oven, even today, with a little bit of nutmeg, a little bit of season, like, is delicious. So I can't even knock the simplicity of that recipe. And it makes your house smell so wonderful. Yeah. I was interested. I know you had mentioned that phrase, as American as apple pie, and I was like, where did that come from? And I spent probably too much time trying to figure that out. The best I can do was somebody referencing a men's suit company using that for the first time in 1924. And I went and I tried to at least find that advertisement, and I came up with nothing. But you can track, I was looking up advertisements, I was looking through newspapers, and you can start to see that coming really into publication by the 1930s, 1940s. Definitely by World War II, that was a big statement to say. I did find this advertisement, which I think is quite, I'll let everybody look at it. Let's get it up. As American as apple pie. This is for whoops, I hit the wrong button as per usual. This is for a plastic company who manufactures plastic. So plastics are American as apple pie. And then I started thinking about plastic consumption and the fact that it is not recyclable and bad for the environment, and this kid eating apple pie off of plastic. It's everybody's favorite things put together. I did love it though. It was one of those, I started looking through the Library of Congress, and it gave me this one from the Science History Institute collection. And they were just looking at the rise of plastic, and this was in one of their collection kits. And it was just, It's perfect because you can still, I think if there's a it looks like Pyrex glass in the back left-hand corner too. But it looks like my Fiesta ware that I use at home. I can't say anything. But yeah, that was a great advertisement that I found. But you know, as American as apple pie is one of those like phrases, and that reminds me of good plug for the apples episode that we did last year. I think we did it in our second season, right? Of me trying to figure out where that nickname of the Big Apple came from, and again concluded with a lot of urban legend mixed in with a lot of lore, and it just spiraled out of I don't know how, and then New York City became the Big Apple. Probably something to do with the apple production, but very unclear. But it's a good phrase. I learned that we had a lot of people who were obsessed with apple pie. If we want to talk a little bit about apple pie, amongst my research, I found that the Beecher family, like Henry Beecher Stowe, were really into apple pie. The whole family, all three of them, wrote about apple pie, wrote about their love of apple pie, shared their apple pie recipes. Harry Beecher Stowe used to have Henry Ward Beecher, excuse me, I'm mixing their names up. Henry Ward Beecher had a weekly column in the New York Ledger, and one of the weeks he focused completely on the topic of apple pie, how to make a good apple pie, what that meant to make an apple pie. And he lists in the essay like 3 or 4 different types of apples that they had on hand at all time. So then I was like, okay, well, where are the recipes? Then I had to go find the recipes. I'll pull that up. There were a few of them, actually. His wife ends up, whoops. I'm not good at share screen. I will never get over this. I know it's been several years since we've been doing this, but it doesn't come easy to me. This is his wife's recipe that appeared in the Plymouth Fair cookbook. 12 large sour apples, very simple recipe, pour into the custard, put strips of the crust. So, I mean, by 1862, the crust is now part of the pie. We've made that transition. It's not necessarily just a coffin anymore. Bake a light brown, sift sugar over it when done, if liked. I mean, these sound delicious. And then his sister also publishes Mrs. Beecher's Domestic Recipe Book in 1862. These are different pies that were in there. So they had a potato pie, which also sounded delicious, and a chicken pie. And again, very simple recipes. I always love looking at colonial and 19th century cookbooks because they're so simple and to the point of here are your ingredients, here's how you make them. I mean, again, we've had this conversation of a lot of it has to be inferred. You have to have known how to break down a chicken beforehand, how to like warm up the hearth before. But here it's called an excellent apple pie recipe, which I was like, I love the ego on it that you're calling it an excellent apple pie. And then on the left is the entire chapter of puddings and pies, which again get mixed together and get kind of conflated depending on what time period you're looking at or who's describing them. A lot of things that we kind of see today. It's not too far off. Oatmeal mush, I just consider that oatmeal in the morning. But the excellent apple pie, again, looks really good. Syrup, cinnamon, rose water, me and Catherine's favorite ingredient, or any other spice enough to flavor it well. And then divide it among the pies, makes good paste, bake light brown. There's all these delicious things in it.
I think it's so interesting that the Beechers were so into apple pie, especially because around the same time in the 19th century, there was like this real pushback against pie from some, some people in that kind of homemaking cookery world. So a little bit before Catherine Beecher's cookbook came out in the 1860s. There was another cookbook that came out, Sarah Josepha Hale. She was like 1830s, 1840s. She had some, she was a big name and a big influence in 19th century American cookery. And she hated pies. She included them in her cookbook, but she had like these really snarky lines about how the pies were bad, or like fruit is good, but pies are bad. And it's a pity to ruin ripe fruit by putting it in a pie. Things like that. And I think she concedes that apples are maybe the only fruit that she would accept in a pie. But everything else, she just like really didn't like it. But I think at the same time, among the general public, pies were, very popular. And so she had to put these recipes in her cookery books. So I just think it's like, I'm just kind of imagining this like Cold War in the cookery field, the pro pie and the anti pie factions.
Yeah, those two groups were butting heads for at least half a century, because you noted that early, and I can see it through the early 20th century. They considered themselves food reformers, was a term that was associated with the people who were like very anti-pie that I was researching. And it goes hand in hand with the growth of like the health food industry and the diet industry. And they thought pie was the worst thing that you can eat, like you said, because you're ruining perfectly good fruit. But it was also a very anti-immigrant reform, because it was, well, who has money to get that fresh fruit that they can eat it that way, that they wouldn't have to make it in a different way. Like it's a very unmoral food. And it was, well, who was eating the pies at the time in the country? And look what was going on. You had all of this great reform. You had all of this great change going on. The populations in New York City were booming, and of different people who couldn't pay for organic raspberries in tiny little carts. There's a whole other conversation about organic food that could be had, but I digress. There was one woman, I took a quote from her New York Times article in 1902, and she just goes, "No great man was ever fond of pie." And somebody responded to that and listed almost every president's favorite pie. And it was like, well, George Washington liked pie, and Abraham Lincoln loved pie. And they were just going through, and they were like, this country was made on pie. So we couldn't put it in these slides, but if anybody ever wants to just look at New York Times articles, I think are probably the most accessible. People going back and forth, arguing with each other about the importance of pie in the United States as like a staple to our diet. And you can really see that shift, because in the temperance movement during this time picks up, and things like that marble pie that I was talking about, they don't want to include any pies that have any kind of liquor in them. So things with sherry in them, with port in them, kind of get pushed aside. And they won't eat savory pies, because that's even worse for you, because that's even more heavily processed than the fruit that you're wasting to go into the sweet pies. And it kind of like this poor fight between sweet and savory is happening, while this whole group is trying to push them completely out of the American diet. And we lost the savory pie. The sweet pie is the one that made it out of it. Because I know when we started our first initial conversations about how we wanted to do this lecture, I was like, we can't think of any savory pies to like, my first thought was like cherry pie, apple pie, like a tart, something that had fruit, something that was colorful. And I went, oh yeah, chicken pot pie. Oh yeah. And I feel like we should bring back a good savory pie. I don't know. I know my mother had gotten me a vegetable pot pie a month ago or two, and I was like, this is delicious. Like I devoured it. They're beautiful individual sized just pot pies. Bring back the savory pies.
Yeah. I found a recipe for an onion pie that looked really good. Yeah, that was in one of the cookbooks. I can't remember. So yeah, vegetable pies, which, kind of a vegetable pie would be pumpkin pie.
Everybody's second favorite, well, first favorite pie right now, right? We're going into Thanksgiving.
Yeah. So pumpkin pie, whereas apple pie is we've kind of adopted it as an American pie,
Mhm.
right? Well, even though its origins do not begin in America. Pumpkin really is American. It's a North American, it's native to North America. Um, and while the first colonists and explorers to come to North America do bring the pumpkin back to Europe, where they kind of figure out what to do with this strange orange fruit vegetable thing. The pumpkin pie, especially the pumpkin pie we know today, is truly an American creation.
Yeah, it's delicious. I will say.
Yeah.
Get
But
my
this is one that it was hard to find the recipes at first because they're not usually called pies, right? You can see on Mary's slide here, the Virginia housewife, she calls it a pumpkin pudding.
the struggle that I was on to find pumpkin pies. And this the American cookery is pumpkin. So when I was looking, I was like, that looks weird. And I had to zoom in and I realized it was POMP, pumpkin. And then you have pumpkin pie, and then you have pumpkin pudding. So this goes into that original concept of like, well, what is a pie? And what does that mean to all of these different people writing these cookbooks in different regions, and how they would define the concept of a pie versus a pudding? I would eat all three of these if that makes you feel any better. There was not one that I wouldn't have eaten.
Yeah.
But they were, I mean, pumpkin was such a staple in the diet. That was just a good, it's got minerals, it's got vitamins, it's high in fiber, you can easily digest it, it's easy to grow. I have fond memories of my grandparents growing pumpkins in our yard growing up and cutting them up and making little like pumpkin feta Greek pies. So good memories.
Yeah. So the very early pumpkin pies that I found, especially the ones like the pumpkin pies that you find in like French cookbooks, are mostly they're just like sliced pumpkin. It's not the custard quite yet. Um, and so it's not until I think some of the English recipes cookbooks have like this custardy pumpkin pie similar to what we have today. Um,
Mm.
but it isn't until like the mid 18th century that pumpkin pie looks like a pumpkin pie, as we would think of it. Um, and and the other thing I love about it is like a lot of the recipes are very, I don't know, loose about the amount of sugar or spices, and they're just like as much sugar as you see fit, or as much spices as you see fit, or whatever to taste. Um, and so by the 19th century, it really becomes like pumpkin pies. The pumpkin is really just a vehicle for getting sugar and spices into your mouth. uh,
There's nothing wrong with that, to be clear.
yeah.
Well, it's also it adds to where was it? 1929 is when they first start canning pumpkin for like grocery store easy consumption. And that takes out all of the hard work that you would have to do to get the pumpkin, cut the pumpkin up, strain it, mash it, and do whatever you kind of do to whatever regional pumpkin pie, pumpkin pudding situation that you have, that they're like, here's your can, go do what you want to do with it. And it makes concept of pumpkin pie almost as popular as American pie, as apple pie for a little bit, because it was just so simple to make. Because then, like you said, you can change the amount of spices you want, sugar you want, kind of crust that you want. It's a little bit more, it's easy to customize it, which I think people enjoy when it comes to recipes. Because I
Yeah.
mean, we've had this conversation.
Yeah. And speaking of customization, I did learn throughout the 19th century, um, there was kind of a competition between pumpkin and other squashes as the pie filling, and which one was better. You know, certain people really liked pumpkin pie. Some people thought that just other squashes were preferred. But either way, it was really just like, how can we get all of these great spices and sugar? But what really sealed the deal for pumpkin pie, and the reason we have pumpkin pie today and not just like squash pie, is because in the 1920s, with the boom in commercial canning, Libby's, the pumpkin, you know, the canned pumpkin company, also they partnered with evaporated milk companies. And so they really were able to push pumpkin ahead of squash, and now pumpkin pie is the go-to, and not squash pie.
Did I not find that one out when I was looking up Libby? Oh my goodness, I wasn't reading. That's so smart.
Yeah.
That's why Libby's is the reason we have pumpkin pie. I've never had squash pie. Has anybody who's watching ever had a squash pie? I'm interested to know if the texture would be different. Because I mean, like, I've had zucchini fritters, kind of like I'm kind of thinking it might be a grittier taste than a pumpkin, but I don't know how like a zucchini would be. I've had zucchini bread. Well, I keep saying zucchini, but that's not quite squash. That's where my brain went. I'm so interested. Has anybody had like an offbeat kind of pie? Maybe not necessarily a pumpkin or an apple, but like, what's the best pie you've ever had? Because I have already pre-ordered my favorite pie from Lady Bird Bakery in Park Slope for Thanksgiving. I'm very excited about it. I have it once a year. It does have a crust. It's got a great crumble on top. I am not good at making pies. Winter squash and pumpkin are related, so they make a great pie. Claire, fabulous to know. I wonder if I can find a winter. There's definitely in American Cookery is a winter squash pie if anybody wants to go look. All of these cookbooks, which is the best part about this time period, you can easily find online. They've all been digitized. You can go print out the whole thing. And I like to make little annotated notes on mine as to be like, don't do this. Use a heavy cream on this. Chelsea said, my sister made a blue squash pie, very similar, but has a more yellow to blue color than pumpkin, if that makes any sense. It's almost gray, not as appetizing. Okay. Was it spiced enough? Do you think it was just, were you looking at the flavor of the squash and it didn't have enough kind of extra pizzazz or anything? Interesting.
I don't know. Yeah, I think the spice is the important part in pumpkin, right? What spices you choose. Because pumpkin, it does have some flavor, but it's not like super strong. And so it really is like that good blend. I find a good pumpkin pie is like a good mix of the pumpkin flavor and the spices.
It's not texturally pleasing as a pumpkin. Well, Chelsea, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for supporting your sister's endeavors. You're a better sister than I would be. I think I was looking at trying to figure out modern pies and maybe taking that trajectory. And we had talked a little bit about sweet potato pie and putting mushrooms on it and toasting it and how that's like such a modern American food that, I mean, it's something so simple that we think of today that's like really not seen anywhere. But even, I mean, they have like Southern dishes that are completely different from like the Northeast.
Yeah, and I think that was part of, I did notice that even just right before the revolution, you start seeing like regional pride in very specific pies, right? And it becomes so that's when we start to see like that web of like pie types kind of really explode, and every, you know, every little region has its own preferred pie and their specialty. And then you get like the really fun names for pies, you know, shoe pie chess pie and
Mhm.
things like that. And just the creativity, I think, that people have had throughout the years regarding pies and the things that they've been able to do, especially in like really dire times when they don't have, like during the Great Depression and the Depression pies and the things that they're able to create with out of practically nothing.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's part of the reason why pie really just kind of stuck around in the American culture, pie in whatever form, really, um, is because it was so versatile and people could be creative about it.
Yeah. You can throw anything into a pie and just hope for the best. It's great.
Yeah.
I love a good I got very excited about today and I was finishing up my notes and I decided I was going to have a slice of apple pie for dinner. So I will worry about that crash in about an hour from now with all the sugar, but it was absolutely worth it. Um, I think the one thing I want to point out before we maybe open it up to questions or comments, if anybody has any, is when I was looking through the recipe books and I was going through multiples of them, what I noticed between the sweet and the savory, which was very distinct, was that the savory ones were organized by main ingredients. So the chicken pie was always with the poultry, or the calf's head was always with the meat sections, and they were kind of done by that major category, where all of the sweet pies were always put together and mixed that way. So you go apple pie, cherry, like berry pie, that way. And I thought it's a very distinct way to categorize them as well, because they already knew that the desserts were always going to be with the desserts and they were mixed in with the puddings and the tarts and all that other stuff. But the meat-based pies, even the seafood ones, were always put together in that kind of different category, and you'd have to go look for them individually. Whereas I always knew you'd open up the couple of pages on a cookbook from the 18th century and all of the sweets would always be together. And I think it's kind of the same today. I don't think I've ever looked at a cookbook and they've separated all any savory meat pies by savory. They're always kind of mixed in together.
So Claire asks, what do you know about mock apple pie made with Ritz crackers? I've never had it. Was it a Depression era dish? I
I think so.
believe so. I've heard of mock apple pie. I've never made it. I haven't seen a recipe for it. But mock pies, so pies that are mimicking other flavors, was very common. And one of the ones that I thought was really interesting was when colonists first came to North America, they used cranberries to make mock cherry pies. So it wasn't like a true cranberry pie, but because they didn't quite have the access to the cherries, or at least the cherries they were used to, they used cranberries instead. So that was, but mock pies of whatever ingredient are very common. And I think that's like, you want something that's familiar, but you don't have that access to those ingredients. And so you kind of try and figure it out the best way you can, make it taste like home.
I wonder if that must have been, a cranberry is much more tart than, depending on if they're in season or not. But I wonder if you had to add more. Oh, thank you, Candy. Ritz mock apple pie. I will open that afterwards, but I'm imagining they soaked the Ritz cracker in water or something to expand it, or a broth, and they would add in. If they didn't have apples available. Again, we're going back to like that cinnamon nutmeg mixture of the concoction.
Yeah, so if anyone has any other questions or comments, put them in the chat. We've got a little bit over 10 minutes left till the
I will
hour.
share my favorite advertisement that I did find. It's I want to buy this. So when you look into companies manufacturing pies as like a pie company, the big one that comes up is Lloyd J. Harris Pies Co., which I think was based out of Chicago from all of the stuff that I was looking at. I found this also on Library of Congress. I I love this one. It's a missed opportunity for the oars not to have been forks, but we'll live with it. But this is like perfect for the season. We're going into Washington, crossing the Delaware, and like we're rapidly approaching that time. And it's just a good play on something that was so recognizable at the time. Like I would have bought this pie if I had seen it in a magazine. I'd be like, this is it. I'm not buying an Entenmann's cake. This is what I'm buying. I loved this one, so I had to share it with everybody. I hope everybody got a good chuckle out of it too. It's just so perfect. I love when companies do things like this. I wish they were also like different flavor pies. Just giving me like, what are the varieties of pies that Lloyd J. Harris sells? Tell me more. But I mean, they've hooked me in. So if this was 1947, I would have gone immediately to the grocery store. But it's great. I love it.
So Chelsea says she was wondering if we found anything about pie and the founding fathers. I did not look specifically like to see what, Washington's favorite pie was and things like that. I did see them mentioned, in various places, like Jefferson had a lot of apple, orchards at Monticello, and so there's like connections to he would have had apple pies and things like that. But I did look, not for the founding fathers, but 18th century. I did look to see if I could find anything in the collection here at Keeler Tavern about pies, or pie making.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't able to find, like, there were no records that said, Timothy or Esther made or served pies here at the tavern to guests or things like that. But I did look in, and let's see, here we go.
My goodness, Catherine, you've got all these slides. What do you got going on?
So I did find out about the dishware that was used for making pies. And so redware was the most common thing used for pie plates. And not Ridgefield, but the next town south, or 2 towns south from us, Norwalk, which is right on the Long Island Sound, was famous for its redware pottery. And redware was very inexpensive during the 18th century. And so we have a couple of redware plates. I've got one here that's from Norwalk. It's a Norwalk redware. And so pie plates were, and pie, what we would call like a pie tin, I guess, pie plate, would have mostly been made out of redware. This top photo is actually from James Townsend and Sons. You can get reproduction, food safe if you want to make an 18th century pie in the proper thing. But I also found not pie plates, but pudding pans. And Timothy was purchasing pudding pans from various wholesalers to sell at his store here at the tavern. So you can see here's a bill of sale that Timothy and his business partners got. So they bought a dozen pudding pans. And so in the lower picture, the pudding pan is the one kind of in the upper corner. It's slightly deeper than a pie plate, but you do find recipes, especially for things like pumpkin pie. So these custardy pies that were also labeled puddings, they would say to use a pudding pan. So, Timothy's got access to the right cookware for Esther to make pies and things like that. So I did find that. And then I found he was selling a lot of the spices that we would see that would be in pies. So we have ginger, allspice, and there was another one for cinnamon, and he's got nutmeg. But the interesting thing I found about this is if you look at the dates for these bills of sale, he's buying these in May and February, like early in the year. But if you look at his account books of when he's selling these things, it's not until the fall. So you don't see references to people purchasing ginger or allspice until like October, November. So like right around now, which I consider pie season.
All year is pie season, Catherine.
So I don't know if that was because at the, people are using it at that time, or maybe he's pre-buying. So that's something we'll have to like look into more. But so that was kind of my dive into the Ridgefield connection to pie. But I think it's one of these things, tavern bills of fare don't really stick around because they weren't printing like paper menus and things like that, right? It's usually something chalked on the wall, and so it's even more ephemeral than a piece of paper, which is kind of a shame when you're trying to find out what they served in taverns. But the other interesting thing I was looking into, and I didn't quite find an answer to it, was what do you do if you didn't have access to wheat? Like, how do you make your pie crust without wheat, right? And I know there's other grains that you make flour from, rye, buckwheat, that I assume you can make pie crust out of. I know you make bread out of these things. So because as I was looking through the ledgers and doing research into 18th century agriculture here, Ridgefield was not very successful in growing wheat. There's certain periods where there's like a boom in wheat, but then in other years it's rye or buckwheat, and there's like literally nobody is trading in any wheat flour at all. So I did find that interesting because, and I didn't see any recipes or any mention that people were substituting rye, buckwheat flour for their pie crust. Like you see wheat alternative bread recipes, rice bread and potato bread, and things like that I found in these cookbooks, but no kind of pie crust recipe, because Amelia Simmons has 9 pie crust recipes in her cookbook, and it's a very small cookbook, but they were all call for wheat flour.
Was it during a certain time period that they were missing, that you couldn't get access to wheat? I mean, was it around the time of the Revolution where access to any of that was very difficult?
I know there were like periods when there's like disease, and there's like this fly, I can't remember the name of it, but there's like this infestation of this fly that destroyed wheat crops. And there are certain years where it was like throughout the entire colonies there was like wheat shortage, but it didn't seem to, granted we are missing like sections, we don't have the full chronology in the account books, but it doesn't line up with any of like the big wheat shortages that I know of. So it was very interesting, but you rarely ever see wheat and rye or wheat and buckwheat listed in the ledgers at the same time. So
I wonder, maybe they were just experimenting to see like cost per volume that they were ordering, if it was easier to make with a different substitute. I mean, that's always an option.
I think, well, this is people trading their wheat for goods at the tavern or at the store. So these are farmers in Ridgefield who are raising this crop. So that's interesting. Maybe we need to do like a whole wheat episode or grains episode program. Maybe next season.
We are coming up on time. So if anybody has any last questions, comments, concerns, shoot them in the chat box. I would like to say thank you to Keeler Tavern for letting us continue on with our taproom tastings. This is one of the most fun things that I get to do with Catherine, and I enjoy seeing so many faces from Keeler Tavern. We have a great season coming up. Some of the are the tickets and the schedule on the website, or am I giving away full spoilers?
No, everything's on the website.
Oh, okay.
So we do have a full season. So it's 6 lectures in total every month until April. And all the topics are on our website. And I know many of you have, but you can sign up for the whole season at once on our website. So you can do that. And then we'll put the recording on our YouTube page and send it out to everybody who's registered as well. And thank you, Chelsea, the next program will be on Tuesday, December 13th.
Yes, it's on coffee.
Yes, coffee. We'll all need it in the holiday season.
We hope all of you can join us. We have other episodes we have coming up are sugar and rum. We've got desserts, right? I think that was our February one because we thought that would be very romantic for Valentine's Day.
I think we're doing bread.
Yeah, that'll go into a good wheat conversation. There we go.
Yeah,
to cover it.
And we're also going to do one on historic cookbooks. So if you're interested in all the cookbooks that we've kind of teased over the course of our talks, we'll get to go dive in a little deeper then. So